with the triumph of 1776, you had a geometric, exponential expansion of enslavement. And of course, once again, many of our scholars who seem to lack curiosity have not sufficiently addressed why there were only 13 colonies that revolted. What happened to Quebec? Why weren't they included? There were left-wing alternatives on the ballot. So there was a party of socialism and liberation. I mean, come on. Stop making excuses for this backwardness and grasp the nettle. Somebody's going to have to explain to our grandchildren how the planet ended up in a China-centric context.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to De Facto. This is Monday, August 18th, 2025, and I am joined today by Dr. Gerald Horne, Moores Professor of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston, author of the new book, The Capital of Slavery, Washington, D.C., 1800 to 1865, just came out from International within the last couple months or so. Dr. Horne, welcome back to the program, and thank you for joining me once again.
Thank you for inviting me.
So in this book, you examine the history of Washington, D.C. and surrounding areas, including Maryland, Virginia, Chesapeake region, Tidewater regions more generally, including a little further south to the Great Dismal Swamp. And you examine the institution of slavery and the abolitionist and revolutionary forces that endeavored to defeat this vile institution. Thus, in this book, you return to several, actually numerous topics that you have explored in some of your other work: Haitian Revolution, War of 1812, John Brown's Uprising, U.S. Civil War, and so forth. So my first question for you, Dr. Horne, why did you write this book, and what was it like returning to some of these topics? And are there any new revelations or epiphanies that you think are worthy of mentioning here?
Well, first of all, let me place this text in the context of historiography. That is to say, in recent years, a schism has developed with regard to the historical analysis of the United States of America. It was reflected in the storm of controversy surrounding the 1619 project by Nikole Hannah-Jones of Howard University, where she was attacked by establishment historians, attacked by the White House, in fact, which in response developed the so-called 1776 project. Because Professor Hannah-Jones had the audacity to suggest that when slaveholders, led by George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Patrick Henry, revolted against British rule in 1776, that, believe it or not, slavery might have had something to do with it. Now, of course, others quite appropriately have suggested that land had something to do with the revolt. Recall the so-called proclamation line of 1762, 1763, where London expressed displeasure in continuing to expand westward across the continent of North America, expending blood and treasure, fighting the Native Americans. You may have noted that in the book On the Table, The Capital of Slavery, I was able to examine the last will and testament of George Washington. And it's fair to say that he may have been one of the most significant landholders worldwide, not to mention in the early republic. And I should also point out that Nikole Hannah-Jones is not solitary or alone in terms of revisiting the process that led to the creation of the United States of America. How could it be otherwise? That is to say, if even as our friends on the left continue to insist 1776 was such a great leap forward for humanity, well, then why was it accompanied by genocide against the indigenous population, first in the 13 colonies and then spreading westward to the Pacific coast? I think we'll have time to talk about my sojourn in the Pacific Northwest, the Canadian Southwest for most of 2025, where I'm exploring this in some detail in terms of the rise of Oregon and the state of Washington into the Union, uh, the former in the 1850s, for example, with some of the bloodiest battles uh, ever envisioned on this continent. And of course, we all know that with the triumph of 1776, you had a geometric, exponential expansion of enslavement of Africans. The number ballooning and mushrooming from the thousands in the late 18th century to the millions on the verge of the US Civil War. And so, as is oftentimes said in diplomatic parlance, the ball is now in the court of those who continue to insist that 1776 was a great leap forward for humanity, not only because of the aforementioned genocide and mass enslavement, but also how do you explain events today, for example? Where did the United States go off the rails in terms of some, including the late U.S. Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, suggesting we may be on the verge of fascism? How did we get from a great leap forward for humanity to the verge of neo-fascism? Uh, as the lawyers might say, the burden of proof has shifted. And it's incumbent upon those who are trying to defend the tattered origin story of the United States to respond to these inquiries. Because it's not just Nikole Hannah-Jones, perhaps the most garlanded Black historian of recent decades, speaking of Tyler Stovall, a former president of the American Historical Association, former professor at the University of California at Berkeley. He wrote this book, White Freedom, which, as the title suggests, exemplifies some of these trends I've just been articulating. I'm thinking of the paramount Black intellectual Ishmael Reed, now approaching 90, headquartered in the San Francisco Bay Area, who did a send-up and a spoof of the Disney come Broadway extravaganza, Hamilton, of Lin-Manuel Miranda, where he echoes some of these points about slavery. I'm thinking of the eminent filmmaker, Raoul Peck. Some in the audience might be familiar with his docudramas, including Lumumba on the Congolese national hero, in addition to the young Karl Marx. His documentary, Exterminate All the Brutes, a sweeping castigation of settler colonialism. Many of our friends on the left are more prone to apply that descriptor, settler colonialism, to historic Palestine, to their credit, but not necessarily to their own homeland. If I were an Israeli patriot, I'd probably accuse them of anti-Semitism. As a result, I'm surprised they haven't been accused of anti-Semitism. And then I could go on with this litany. Charles Mills, the late Charles Mills of Jamaican extraction, his book, The Racial Contract. So this book at hand also can be seen in the context of my earlier work, The Counter-Revolution of 1776, Slave Resistance, the Origin of the United States of America, Negro Comrades of the Crown, African Americans of the British Empire fight the United States before emancipation. A number of historians, before I published the latter work, pointed to this very curious detail that Black Americans, and I should say with good reason, were really sympathetic, shall we say, to London with regard to its conflicts in the United States of America. You mentioned the War of 1812, which we'll get to in a second, which exemplifies that particular trend. And I've even thought, although I haven't written, that with regard to the naming practices of Black Americans, that it's oftentimes assumed, and understandably, that the proliferation of British surnames, like Horne, for example, with regard to the slave descendant population, comes from slave masters, but it could just as well be another kind of homage to London, for example. Although, of course, that's just a hypothesis. I've not explored it in writing. So in any case, this particular work uh, does not appear in a vacuum. Uh, there is the schism, and I've noticed that some of our friends on the left, they don't like to conjure up the reality that this might be, as they say in the United States, a racial schism, because all of the aforementioned creators happen to be of African extraction. And many of our friends on the left that I'm referring to could easily be described as settler descendants. And, people get nervous when you speak in those terms. Perhaps they think that it augurs a descendant of another slave revolt, or that once again will align with the real or imagined enemies of the United States and upset the status quo. Whatever the case, that is the reality, a so-called racial schism in the historiography, which, if I may, uh, brings us to the book at hand, which I'll proceed to provide an overview of, if you don't mind.
Oh, sure. Just one quick point before you get to the overview. Your naming practices are making me think of some of these jazz figures like Duke Ellington,
Mm.
Count Basie, who adopt that sort of royal moniker in their performance. And there's probably many other examples.
Hey, I'm sure that one of the acute defenders of the United States will say, "What about Lester Prez Young? I mean, he was the president. That's a Republican term. What are you talking about?" Okay, fair enough.
Okay. Well, anyway, no, please go ahead and proceed to the overview.
Okay, so the book at hand is a synthesis from roughly 1800, when John and Abigail Adams were moving into the White House, recently constructed, by the way, by enslaved African labor for the most part. And the opening chapter deals with Abigail Adams staring out of her window and noticing malingering Africans. If she had a deeper understanding of slavery in the United States, she would not be surprised by that kind of resistance, because malingering was an essential element of resistance. And in fact, a major subtheme of this book, and a subtheme of the book I think we discussed, African Americans in a New History of the United States of America, is that you've had two conflicting trends, political trends, explosive trends in this settler colonial republic. In other words, settler colonialism, from its inception, the abortive settlement in what we call North Carolina in the 1580s, involved class collaboration, the 1% in London sponsoring a heterogeneous mixture of Europeans migrating across the Atlantic with mutual benefit in mind. And of course, I draw a straight line from that kind of class collaboration to the rise of neo-fascism, uh, with regard to November 2024, the 77 million who voted for neo-fascism fundamentally, with many of our friends on the left, per usual, scrambling to rationalize or somehow justify what cannot be justified, making excuses, all manner of excuses for this dilemma. On the other hand, materially speaking, because of their position as an unpaid sector of the working class, the enslaved population was forced into class struggle. I think that goes hand in hand with being unpaid, including malingering, including armed resistance. Armed resistance, of course, I talk about not only in the 19th century, but in my book, Armed Struggle, with a question mark, which deals with this phenomenon in the late 20th century, for example, with the rise of the Black Panther Party. In any case, the book then migrates, as you have suggested, to a topic I've discussed before, the War of 1812, whereby you begin to see resistance in action, particularly in August 1814, when the Redcoats invade Washington, D.C., setting alight the White House, sending President James Madison and his garrulous spouse Dolly fleeing to the streets one step ahead of the posse, being joined by enslaved Africans from the surrounding area who then hop on British boats and migrate to what is now Trinidad and Tobago, where their descendants continue to reside. When I spoke in New York on the Negro Comrades of the Crown book, which also deals with resistance during the War of 1812, some of the descendants of those Trinidadians were in the audience, for example, because, of course, contrary to enslavement propagandists, they were freed upon arriving in Trinidad and Tobago. There was a hysterical reaction, perhaps understandably, to this phenomenon because the United States had barely escaped losing its sovereignty, with the Black population joining in to try to ensure that that eventuated. The free Negro population was scapegoated, particularly down the road in Baltimore. There is a lot of Baltimore history in this text because Washington and Baltimore are tied together umbilically, we should say. Now, I think it's a bridge too far to suggest that the free Negro population, of which Baltimore had the most sizable number in the Republic, were responsible for what the slaves did, but it was felt that they were a bad example because being free, it could inspire the enslaved population to aspire towards that status, which of course was the case. So that leads to the formation of the American Colonization Society shortly after the conclusion with the treaty signed in what is now Belgium in January 1815. The American Colonization Society, which includes many of the leading lights of the Republic, including the Chief Justice of the United States of America, come up with the idea that the free Negro population should be deported en masse. And that leads to the creation of the state of Liberia in Western Africa, approximately 2 centuries ago. Interestingly enough, quite energetic in terms of seeking to establish settlements in Liberia was the state of Maryland. I mean, here you had a state that had its own foreign policy, that set up its own settlement, Cape Palmas, for example, which eventually was folded into Liberia because they wanted to get rid of the free Negro population of Baltimore. And then with the Nat Turner revolt of August 1831, a revolt of the enslaved in Virginia, with the massacring of dozens of settlers by enslaved Africans, the idea took flight that a number of the enslaved should be freed and sent off to West Africa, sent packing, for example. In the state of Mississippi, for example, one of my current projects examines slavery in Mississippi, where my ancestral roots rest. Mississippi was quite energetic in seeking to deport Negroes. And of course, Mississippi has the distinction of having, percentage-wise, the largest number of Black people, which in part helps to explain its reactionary politics. Because the settlers are living cheek by jowl with once reviled property, which has shown an inclination to rebel. In any case, I spend quite a bit of time in this book talking about international relations. I mean, to expand the thread on Liberia, understandably, the U.S. Negro settlers have been scorned and excoriated because of their conflicts with the pre-existing indigenous African population, particularly the Kru, K-R-U, when they arrive on those shores of West Africa. But as I point out you can easily access this, I'm sure, online. If you look at the Declaration of Independence of Liberia in the 1840s, it's quite progressive, quite angry, in fact, furious about what's going on in the United States of America, which then leads Liberia not to neglect those it left behind, speaking of the enslaved population in North America, by aligning with British abolitionists, for example, the bête noire, if I can use that term, with regard to the settler class in North America, the enslaver class, even with Haitian revolutionaries, who I guess I should have said preempted, speaking of British abolitionists, as the bête noire by speaking of Haitian revolutionaries as the true bête noire. And Haiti, as in a number of my books dealing with slavery, plays a preeminent role in the text at hand. And I'll get to that with a bit of detail in a second. But I should also return to this chronological unfolding and leaping ahead to October 1859 with John Brown's raid, now celebrated by many. Interestingly enough, this raid on what was then Virginia, now West Virginia, speaking of Harper's Ferry, the Armory, seeming to suggest an armed uprising against enslavement, was plotted in Canada, which had provided a sanctuary for fleeing property. That helps to explain U.S. motivation during the War of 1812 to cut off that route of escape and, in fact, claim Canada, which has been resuscitated by the descendant of the Confederates and of the U.S. right-wing oligarchy, speaking of the tangerine tyrant himself, who's spoken quite ominously about annexation of Canada, making it the 51st state. Nothing new in that regard. That's been a wish of many of these Republicans. And of course, once again, many of our scholars who seem to lack curiosity have not sufficiently addressed why there were only 13 colonies that revolted. What happened to Quebec, for example? Why weren't they included? They were a colony of Great Britain. Plus, you had a lot of dissatisfaction. Did you see the article in the New York Times just last week about Quebec City? Now, if our friends on the left had inconsistency, they'd speak of the Quebec question as identity politics, because they insist upon their language rights. That's part of their identity, if I can use that term. The New York Times article last week said only 2% of the people in Quebec City are consistent English speakers. When I was in Canada, doing my research in 2025, one of the nostrums I walked away with was that a bromide in Canada for the longest was that bosses spoke English and workers spoke French. Mm-hmm. And so why didn't Quebec join the revolt? Now, I don't want to digress too much, but in my upcoming book, Comparative Settler Colonialism of British Columbia in Canada and Washington State and Oregon, I point out that south of the border, the settlers, they carried quite a bit of animosity towards Catholics. And of course, many of those in Quebec are Catholic. When the Native Americans would revolt, which was their tendency, speaking of the Cayuse, C-A-Y-U-S-E, and the Palouse and the Walla Walla, oftentimes the Catholics, many of whom were of French ancestry, many of whom had mated with indigenous populations, creating this still existing Canadian subgroup of the Métis, M-E-T-I-S, while in the state of what is now the state of Washington, Washington Territory, governor in the 1850s, Isaac Stevens, he declared martial law And one of the triggers for declaring martial law was intermarriage
Mm.
of some of the settlers, some of the Protestant settlers with the indigenous populations, because it was felt that that was a security risk. And in fact, I looked at some of the text on intermarriage in the United States, because there's been a lot of research on that, understandably. And few of these texts put the revulsion towards intermarriage south of the border in the context of settler security, for example, which I will be doing in my forthcoming text. In any case, back to the major thread after that lengthy digression, the John Brown raid plotted in Canada leads to his execution in December 1859. It is seen as auguring worse to come in Dixie, helping to trigger the U.S. Civil War. By the spring of 1861, by 1862, slavery is abolished in the District of Columbia. Things a tale because, as you know, the Emancipation Proclamation emerges on January 1, 1863, but emancipation in the district precedes that. That's not the only peculiarity of emancipation in the district. The enslavers were compensated for the loss of their property. Not unusual, because the enslavers were compensated in Haiti at gunpoint, for example, French gunpoint, in the British Empire, Jamaica, Barbados, etc. When slavery is abolished in the 1830s, the enslavers are compensated, which really gives them a leg up, the enslavers, that is, in terms of not only lining their pockets, but helping them to find other lucrative fields of investment, which serves as a kind of jet fuel for the takeoff of what becomes British imperialism, for example. And needless to say, the enslaved population was not compensated for their free labor. Likewise, in the rest of Dixie, and contrastingly, in the rest of Dixie, the slave owners were not compensated, which I understand why many previous analysts have seen this as a revolutionary act, because in a sense it was. But the other side of the coin is that I don't think you can begin to understand the ferocity and the fury of white supremacy post 1865, with the rise of lynching, the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, the rise of terrorism, without understanding expropriation of property without compensation, which in turn comes to be seen as an emblem of an emerging socialism, which suggests that you cannot understand the ferocity of anti-communism without understanding this pre-existing ferocity generated by having property expropriated without compensation, particularly on the eve of the U.S. Civil War, 1861. The most valuable investment in the Republic was the investment in bodies of enslaved Africans. I pointed out in an earlier text that when the African slave trade, unlamented, was in its heyday, one could invest $1 and get $1,700 back. There are those today who would sell their firstborn for 1,700% profit, not to mention some Africans they did not know. So the demise of slavery in the district and in the Republic at large created multiple resultant problems. And perhaps I should stop there to allow you to interject.
Well, no, I appreciate that very much. That's an excellent overview, and I appreciate the detours also into the work you're working on at this moment, having to do with comparative settler colonialism and so forth. I was going to ask you about this connection that you draw, this lineage you draw between the uncompensated expropriation of private property post 1865 and the sort of specter of the same around 1917, which coincides with the Ku Klux Klan terrorism, things that you've already mentioned. But since you've already sort of broached that, maybe we could just back up a second, and I can ask you sort of a broader question about slavery and republicanism, and why republicanism seemed to, as a doctrine of governance, as a governing philosophy and structure, clung so tightly to slavery, whereas these other trends globally seem to be moving in the other direction, as you suggest in this work and in many other books of yours.
I addressed this in Vancouver, British Columbia, on July 26, 2025. Actually, the address can be found online. As the date suggests, it was marking the anniversary of the attack on the Moncada in Cuba, culminating with the Cuban Revolution, January 1st, 1959. And I pointed out that I was in Canada during the so-called throne speech of the ostensible sovereign, King Charles III, a parasite indeed. And needless to say, there were pro-Republican protesters in Ottawa greeting King Charles III. But as I pointed out, that these Canadian Republicans, if they expect to make progress, they're going to have to distinguish an emerging Canadian republicanism from what emerged south of the border. Otherwise, the Canadian masses will say, oh, you want us to be like the United States? Thanks, but no thanks, for example. Because in a real sense, as I've said in a number of texts, with 1776, what emerged was the decline and the demise of the divine right of monarchs with the divine right of European men of property. And then with Andrew Jackson, the remit expanding across class lines. And that was fundamentally republicanism. Now, for whatever reason, many of our friends on the left, they surmised that if Irish Catholics could be discriminated against in the British Isles, and they can come to the United States and do well, that speaks well for republicanism, and that sets a precedent for Africans, for Black people to do well, because that shows the elasticity of republicanism, for example. But as I've said previously, and this is probably in my book on Southern Africa, that's akin to suggesting that the proclamation of apartheid in South Africa in 1948, which, as I point out, prompted by US elites, was designed to uplift the dispossessed amongst the European minority in the southern tip of Africa in order to forestall class-based alliances across racial lines. It's as if saying that the proclamation of apartheid, designed to uplift all these Europeans, was a precedent that could then be extended to the Africans, to the Indians, to the coloreds, which is laughable. I mean, it doesn't pass the giggle test. I mean, it's ludicrous. It's ridiculous. It's like saying that the ANC, instead of launching the armed struggle, the African National Congress of Nelson Mandela, they should have waited for history to work its magic. And they could have just sat on their hands, and ultimately benefits and emoluments would have descended upon them, like presumably it descended upon Black people and indigenous people in North America. And so Republican, and that also sheds light on what might be considered an anomaly. That is to say, that the fighting forces of the so-called Confederate States of America, which sought to overthrow the Lincoln government, not least to ensure that slavery would persist forevermore, the fighting forces were disproportionately comprised of non-slave owners. And obviously, it's an expression of class collaboration. Obviously, it's a reflection of the fact that perhaps many of these dispossessed European settlers thought that there would be a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, that they could benefit. It's like the stories you used to read about in children's books, where the way you get the barrel or the donkey to pull the cart is that you put a carrot at the end of the stick right in front of the donkey's nose. And the donkey is always moving forward, trying to grasp and eat the carrot, and that pulls the cart.
Mhm.
And so you can easily envision a similar process unfolding today in 2025, helping to explain the rise of these neo-fascist trends, as opposed to these threadbare excuses and rationalizations you oftentimes are subjected to in terms of explicating the voting patterns of the 77 million. That is to say that they just need to be presented with more left-wing alternatives. Well, in Texas, I voted for Cornel West. He didn't do very well. There were left-wing alternatives on the ballot. So there was a party of socialism and liberation. I mean, come on. Stop making excuses for this backwardness and grasp the nettle. In any case, I think that there was a close relationship between republicanism and slavery, a close relationship between capitalism and slavery, as the late Eric Williams, founding father of Trinidad and Tobago, pointed out in his book of the same title, which has led to an explosion of literature, including by my colleague here in Houston, David McNally, his book, Slavery and Capitalism, a Marxist Analysis, just out from University of California Press. De Facto podcast, may want to speak with him.
Oh, certainly.
And other scholars have turned a microscope on the process of enlightenment, which is oftentimes viewed, perhaps understandably, positively insofar as it is revolt against the benighted processes emerging from organized religion. But at the same time, as others have pointed out, perhaps you should not see it as coincidental that an icon of enlightenment, Thomas Jefferson, was a flagrant abuser of Africans, not least in his text, Notes on the State of Virginia, for example. So these contradictions really need to be faced up to. I mean, I understand why there are those who don't want to be marginal. And obviously, there is apparent mass sentiment in favor of 1776, in favor of the Enlightenment, perhaps even in favor of capitalism, although I have my doubts with regard to the latter. And being a critic of these processes in the home of the free, in the home of free speech, that's not necessarily win you plaudits. I mean, it may win you a pink slip, so you lose your job, or worse, may cause you to wear a bulletproof vest. But compared to strugglers and comrades and other battlefields, it's not as onerous here in North America, at least not yet.
Mm-hmm. Wow, thank you for that. That was excellent. Picking up this thread again on the sort of current state of affairs in the United States and globally, actually, I'd like to ask you about maybe how this analysis that you offer in the book can inform us and better position us to understand the contemporary iterations of, for instance, right-wing populism, or what you describe in this book as the precursors to fascism. For instance, in this book, you describe Andrew Jackson as one of the forerunners of right-wing populism, U.S. style. You also talk about Roger Taney, who, prior to his role in the Dred Scott decision of 1857, when he was the Attorney General, uh, announced the Negro Seamen Acts of 1832, which you write sought to make anti-blackness an extension of extraterritoriality. That is, anti-blackness was to be globalized. And Taney, it should be remembered, was the brother-in-law of Francis Scott Key, who you also write about in this book. Um, can you talk a little bit about what you mean by globalized anti-blackness and its relation to right-wing populism and both of their relations to fascism, U.S. style, and how we can begin to understand what's taking place in the United States under the Trump regime, and not solely confined to the Trump regime, as you and I have explored on this podcast and in writing. Um, we have these mass deportations. You even write about self-deportations taking place in uh, the early 19th century, at least the idea that self-deportation was going to be beneficial for the Republic. I could go on and on, but I think you get the gist of my question.
Well, first of all, Francis Scott Key, of course, is renowned as being the alleged author of the national anthem, the Star Spangled Banner, for example, implicated in slavery, as is his relative, Roger Taney, who, as a justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, authored the notorious Dred Scott decision in 1857, and yet another trigger for the Civil War, suggesting that Black people have no rights, that the settlers are bound to respect, reputedly overthrown by the 14th Amendment, and the notion of birthright citizenship now being challenged by the Trump regime, and the downstream consequences of overthrowing birthright citizenship are unclear. Perhaps it will lead to a revival in a more dedicated fashion of Dred Scott. Extraterritoriality should be no surprise to members of your audience, because U.S. foreign policy exemplifies extraterritoriality. I mean, ever since 1917, if not before, they've been trying to export anti-communism. They were basically saying that no country is allowed to take the socialist path. I mean, look at the pressure on socialist Cuba, an embargo, a blockade, repeated assassination attempts against the late President Fidel Castro, for example, all manner of destabilization. Recently, Attorney General Marco Rubio, of Cuban ancestry, has sought to sanction countries like Brazil, who seek to import and utilize Cuban doctors for the benefit of the Brazilian masses. Needless to say, the United States does not plan on finding substitute medics for Brazil. I mean, you hardly have a medical system in this country that attends to the medical needs of the U.S. masses. And I would say that the Negro Seamen Acts are very telling, because it was not only Maryland, and needless to say, Maryland plays a central role in this book, but also South Carolina, which had these Negro Seamen Acts, and that led to contention with London, because London relied heavily upon Negro seamen, and if they were delivering supplies to Charleston, these seamen were penalized, pulverized, for example, displeasing to Her Majesty, for example, complicating relations with the crown, almost leading to an extension of the War of 1812 with the conflict in the 1840s, ostensibly over the Oregon Territory of the U.S., what is now the U.S. Northwest, but actually including a conglomeration of issues, including revulsion at the Negro Seamen Acts. And I should say that, as a keen listener might have gleaned thus far, I pay attention to the international situation in terms of trying to explicate what's happening domestically. Not only because Washington is the capital city, having diplomatic legations from different parts of Europe in particular. And as I said, when Haitian diplomats began to show up after the United States extended diplomatic recognition to that Caribbean nation, many of the settlers were figuratively and sometimes literally losing their minds at that particular arrival. But it also ties into the role of Russia, which is much in the news nowadays because of the Alaska summit. And as newspapers have pointed out, Russia sold its claims to that vast territory in 1867 for a pittance, and in part to try to flummox London, which they thought would ensue if the United States was pressing British Columbia from the north and from the south, Washington State and Oregon. But also, Russia, unlike Britain, which was playing footsies with the Confederates, not to mention the French, who tried to take over Mexico and then cut a deal with the enslavers to continue slavery post-1865, or the Spanish, who were foisting enslavement of Africans upon Cuba. Russia, which had abolished serfdom at the same time that the United States was on the path to abolishing slavery. The historian Peter Kolchin, Kolchin, of the University of Delaware, I think that he's joined the ancestors, has dealt with that in a number of books in terms of comparative history, providing a model that other scholars should seek to emulate. So Russia, during the U.S. Civil War, sent a major fleet to both coasts, to the Atlantic coast and the Pacific coast. And of course, in the run-up to the United States seizing California from Mexico, there remains the Russian River in Northern California, an emblem of Russian claims to what is now the Golden State. But at a certain point, as I'll talk about in this upcoming book, Russia decided that the better part of wisdom was to retreat from Alaska. After all, they had been pummeled by Britain, France, and Ottoman Turkey during the Crimea War of the 1850s and had many debts to pay. And the retreat from Alaska is accompanied by the establishment of Vladivostok, the major metropolis on the Pacific, on the eastern coast of Russia, which provides entree into Japan and China and Korea, for example. So I would argue further that part of the demerits the professor would hand out concerning the Negro leadership, the Douglass leadership, is that the leadership of Frederick Douglass, in other words, is I don't think the Douglass leadership and those comrades paid sufficient attention to the global situation in order to plot the way forward. Perhaps that's why the Douglass leadership has been celebrated in 2025, because some feel that I guess that's a good example, and some I guess just don't know better. Now, the Du Bois leadership in the 20th century began to rectify that demerit, which is one of the reasons Du Bois was chased into exile. One of the reasons why Du Bois was indicted at the age of 83 circa 1950, 1951. And I think that the obvious lesson to be gleaned from this book, not to mention a kaleidoscopic viewpoint of US history and the role of the enslaved population and the indigenous population in particular, is that you really need a global analysis.
Mm-hmm.
You really need to pay attention to what's happening worldwide, because the settlers who are in the majority, as I said, their origin story involves class collaboration. Now, to be sure, that does not include each and every settler descendant. Please do not try to play that trick. But as November 2024 suggested, and as 2025 continues to suggest, uh, class collaboration can be applied to far too many amongst settler descendants.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for that, Dr. Horne. I know we only have a few minutes left here, but I just wanted to ask you a further question on this Russia summit. Obviously, the consequences of which are not measurable at this time. But I wonder if you have any commentary on the significance of the Russia summit, especially in the context that we're speaking of this with this book. You already mentioned the handing over of Alaska in 1867 to the United States. And I can't help but think about this connection that you draw in this work and in other works about the Civil War, 1865 and after, and the connection to the Red Scare, as I've already mentioned, and this sort of Western media hysteria regarding Sergei Lavrov's USSR sweater as he arrives on the shores of Alaska. And I can't help but think, and you'll have to forgive me for this, that we've entered a unique period of the Red Scare that we can now dub the Thread Scare.
Oh, very good. I like that.
No, thank you. I'm just curious about if you have any commentary on the summit and its significance and this media hysteria and so forth.
Well, first of all, I've commented at length on the Alaska summit. You can find both summaries online. A segment on the ground program, WPFW FM in Washington, the Pacific station, broadcasting Fridays, I believe at 10 a.m. Eastern, and on diasporic music coming out of Black Power 96, St. Petersburg, Florida, broadcasting 3:30 Eastern on Sundays. And just to summarize some of the points that I made therein, potentially the Alaska summit is a game changer. And I think that's one of the reasons why you have this extraordinary spectacle unfolding as we speak, with all the top leaders from Europe breaking their schedules and flying in to Washington to meet with Mr. Trump alongside Mr. Zelensky to try to move the US away from what seems to be coming from the Alaska summit. One of the criticisms I would make of some of the commentaries on the Alaska summit, including from some of our comrades, is that they're looking at the summit with tunnel vision. I don't think that you can just look at the summit in the transatlantic sense. You have to look at imperial overstretch, the fact that Israel threatens to reignite the war with Iran, given the influence of Zionist billionaires in the White House. The United States will probably be accompanying the Zionist state in this piratical enterprise. You have to look at the fact that Mr. Trump, according to his former National Security Advisor, John Bolton, sees the EU as a kind of competitor, not an ally who you should try to pull their chestnuts out of the fire. Because, as I pointed out numerous times before, there's a contradiction in European history in terms of the Western Europeans getting fat on the slave trade and colonialism, particularly Britain and France, whereas the major power on the continent was Russia, today a population about twice the size of the locomotive of the European Union, speaking of the Federal Republic of Germany, a mother lode of gold, diamonds, petroleum, natural gas, etc. And so the Europeans feel that they may be left behind as Washington, an overstretched Washington, $37 trillion in debt, moves to cut its losses with the Ukrainian escapade so it can focus not only upon the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, heavy sanctions imposed against South Africa, India, Prime Minister Modi due in China at the end of the month, August 2025, the foreign minister in Moscow as we speak, meeting with the aforementioned Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister of India, that is. Brazil, subjected to punishing sanctions for various reasons. And then there's the big enchilada, the People's Republic of China, sharp clashes in the South China Sea between U.S. Navy and Chinese Navy. I'm happy to say that another project I'm working on is a project involving U.S.-China relations. Somebody's going to have to explain to our grandchildren how the planet ended up in a China-centric context. Right now, I don't see that much evidence that an explanation is forthcoming, so I've decided that I'll try to provide an explanation. So once again, the Alaska Summit is a potential game changer in terms of helping to erode the reason for being of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, coming into existence in 1949 on an explicit anti-Moscow basis. If the generator of NATO, speaking of the United States of America, begins to embrace Russia, well then what is the purpose of NATO, for example? There are major investments bound up in an answer to that question. And in fact, Vice President J.D. Vance has suggested that if Europe wants to continue the Ukrainian escapade, they can buy weapons from the U.S. military-industrial complex, send them to Ukraine, and that struggle will continue. I'm not sure if Europe has the audacity or the mettle to go down that path, but we'll find out soon enough. And so another lesson and another inference we should draw from the Alaska Summit is that Allah, what might be considered as compliment, that is to say, Nixon to China in the early 1970s, which was a real timbalor, similarly upsetting. You should not see it as coincidental that in order to effectuate dramatic changes in terms of U.S. imperialism's foreign policy, it generally requires that a party that commands the settler majority can do the task, not the other bourgeois party, the Democrats, which has to rely very heavily upon the black vote, which is really handicapping nowadays, given the resuscitation of the Confederate impulse. And however, that makes the Democratic Party still a very useful vehicle, particularly given the hysteria you so correctly pointed out in the corporate media, because as a result of the compromise of 1954 with the retreat of Jim Crow, U.S. apartheid, the price of the ticket was throwing overboard the internationalists amongst us, including the late, great multilingual socialist Paul Robeson. And missing in action since then, for the most part, have been many of our Black organizations and Black leaders, which makes the Democratic Party a useful vehicle for militarism, as the Biden administration exemplified by helping to ignite this Ukraine crisis in the first instance. Not to mention, of course, President Johnson, 1963 to 1969, and his escalation of the war in Vietnam. President Truman, 1950 to 1952-53, escalation of the war in the Korean Peninsula. which has as a non too silent pretext seeking to overthrow the Chinese Revolution, October 1949. So there is much bound up with regard to this Ukraine escapade. Like many, I'll be studying the results of this really striking meeting between Macron and Merz and Starmer and Ursula von der Leyen, Mark Rutte, Mark Daddy Rutte, for the Trump whisperer, the leader of Finland, for example. He's a golfer, attended Furman University in South Carolina. It's going to be very interesting. A Hollywood screenwriter of even middling competence could have a field day with this particular episode.
Well, great, Dr. Horne. Thank you so much for that excellent and sweeping analysis of history, the history of DC, and the contemporary international moment that we are living through. We greatly appreciate it. Your China-US relations book, I know you're working on it now. Any indication as to when we might expect that?
Well, this week I'll be at the Truman Library. Of course, I'm going from 1949 forward, so looking at Truman documents. I'll also be visiting the Eisenhower Library, which is really out of the way in Abilene, Kansas. Next week, I'll be at the Gerald Ford Library in Detroit. I'll be Wayne State, the files of Leonard Woodcock, a former leader of the United Auto Workers, the first U.S. ambassador to post-revolutionary China, who, of course, helped to shepherd across the Pacific entire industrial plants from the United States, helping to build this juggernaut. A few weeks from now, I'll be at the Carter Library in Atlanta. I skipped over the JFK Library, which I'll be in at the beginning of September. The Carter Library, I'm only mentioning some of these visits because it's a way to impart some of the lessons I'll be expanding upon. Of course, the Carter Library, the turning point there was the visit of paramount Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping to the United States late 1978. Took the United States by storm, including when he donned a Texas cowboy hat. And that led to even further technology transfers across the Pacific. Then China repaid the favor by attacking Vietnam. I found myself in Vietnam late 1979 after that conflict and after the Vietnamese comrades had overthrown the genocidal Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, oftentimes referred to as Kampuchea back in the day. I was accompanied, just for historical expansion, by Henri Alleg, A-L-L-E-G, a name some might be familiar with. He was a noted French communist journalist, tortured during the Algerian War. Little short guy. It's very, very interesting experience. I've already visited the Reagan Library. I was there in February, as I recall, looking at technology transfers from the United States to China. I mean, what were these people thinking? I guess they underestimated the Chinese. But you know how these U.S. people, they get part of their strength is also their weakness. What I mean, they can be very single-minded and very focused with tunnel vision. And they were so focused on destabilizing the Soviet Union that they lost their wits to a certain extent and have created this juggernaut, which I don't think they'll be able to derail, but we'll see. That's why we study the news.
Right. Wow, excellent. Well, we look forward to that when it does come out. Were you able to find your notes at the Schomburg?
Say that again?
Were you able to obtain your notes at the Schomburg?
Yeah, actually, I'm going to. When is the next time you're going to the Schomburg?
Well, we were planning on sometime this fall, but they were booked up when we wanted to go in actually a couple weeks ago.
Yeah, because as you know, during the 1980s, I took all these notes on what was unfolding. And there should be in my archive at the Schomburg, but we haven't been able to locate them yet. And so I think I'll be able to do an end run around that if they somehow disappear. You never know. Through other sources.
Right. We can always look at the Guardian and the Monthly Review archives as well.
Sure.
But if anyone has any tips, get in touch, because I can tell you which boxes not to look in at the very
Exactly.
least. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Horne, for taking the time to speak with us today on these matters. We really enjoyed this book. By we, I mean Aspen and I. We thought it was excellent, as always, and we look forward to all subsequent work that you are going to produce and having you back on very soon.
Thank you for inviting me.
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.